Jeff Mann, and I'm going to do a video presentation on the topic of trail forearm supination in the late downswing. I'm not a golf instructor, I'm just an amateur golf theorist who has been studying the golf swing for 20 years now. And I'm constantly having to revise my thinking about how does the golf swing work in professional golfers, because I keep on learning new insights into what professional golfers are really doing in their golf swing. And the most amazing golf insight I've discovered in the past 20 years, which surprised me greatly, was the discovery that professional golfers supinate their trail forearm during the late downswing. And this surprised me because I always thought that they would need to pronate their trail forearm in the late downswing. And the reason why I used to believe this was that when I studied the golf swing of professional golfers who use a weak or neutral lead hand grip, then they have to supinate their trail forearm in the late downswing in order to square the club face relative to their club head path, which means that the lead hand is rotating counterclockwise in the late downswing between P6.5 and P7. I therefore thought that if you also have a weak or neutral trail hand grip where the two palms are facing each other across the club handle, I automatically presumed that if the lead hand was rotating counterclockwise between P6.5 and P7, that the trail forearm had to pronate so that the trail palm could rotate at the same speed as the lead palm so that they worked in perfect synchrony. However, I discovered this graph produced by John Sinclair, which proves that professional golfers are actually supinating their trail forearm in the late downswing, and this surprised me greatly. So I'm going to discuss this graph, and then I'm going to discuss the implications of this graph in terms of understanding what professional golfers are doing during the late downswing. So if you look here, I'm going to be using my pointer here, mouse pointer, and I'm going to wiggle it around so you can know which part of the image I'm discussing. So this is a graph of trail forearm pronation and supination in professional golfers. And the horizontal line is the zero line here. And anything above this line is supination, and anything below that line is pronation. And John Sinclair studied over 100 PGA Tour golfers. And the blue line here represents the average value. So if you look here at address, the average pro golfer has his lead forearm supinated at address. Then during the early takeaway, the trail forearm becomes slightly more supinated. Then during the remainder of the backswing, it moves towards becoming less supinated. And at the P4 position, which is the end backswing position, there you can see it's close to zero. It's close to neutral. Now the brown zone here, which I've colored in, represents the early mid downswing between P4 and P6. And if you look at the graph, the blue graph, you can see that professional golfers are supinating their trail forearm during that time period. And the reason why they do that relates to a clubshaft shallowing phenomenon. I'm not going to discuss this issue in this video, and I might do another video where I will discuss this phenomenon. Now, I've colored in the zone from P6 to P7, and that represents the late downswing. And if you notice here, I'm at P6 and the trail forearm is supinated, and it actually becomes more supinated between P6 and P6.5, and then becomes slightly less supinated between P6.5 and P7. But during the entire late downswing, you can see it's very supinated. And John Sinclair wrote this note, still supinating right before impact. Now you'll notice there are green lines here as well, and the green lines represents one standard deviation, which represents 68% of the pro golfers that John Sinclair studied. And if you look, and they represent the range that you could find in professional golfers, and if you look at the P6 to P7 zone, you'll notice that some professional golfers are more supinated than others here, which are less supinated. But there are no professional golfers who actually pronate in their trail forearm during the late downswing. And this surprised me a lot, and I had to think about this for a few years before I worked out why they supinate their trail forearm. And what I did was I looked at a lot of professional golfers' swings, and I confirmed what John Sinclair found in his research study using a 3D machine where he measured the wrist motions and forearm motions in professional golfers using a 3D machine that was made by TPI and apparently designed originally by Phil Cheatham. Now I'm going to give you some examples. So here is an example of a professional golfer. This is Matthew Fitzpatrick, and image 1 shows him at the P6 position. Image 2 is at the P6.5 position when the club shaft is angled at about 45 degrees, and image 3 is at impact. In most professional golfers using a driver, the club shaft might be more vertical, so perpendicular to the ball target line. But in this instance with Matthew Fitzpatrick, he places his ball further back in his stance, and when he comes into impact with his hand slightly ahead of the ball, you can see he has a small degree of forward shaft lean. Now what I've done in this video, I've drawn a blue line here in this image over the middle of his upper forearm and the middle of his elbow pit, which medically is called the antecubital fossa. And that represents essentially the alignment of the trail humerus, trail upper arm, as a reference point. And then I drew a red line over his trail forearm's lower radial bone over there. And if you notice, if you look like he's looking down at his trail forearm from above, this line, the red line, is rotated clockwise relative to the blue line, which means that he is supinated at his P6 position. And you can see that when you supinated and you look at his trail palm here, it's partially under the club handle and partially behind the club handle. Now, as you look at the P6.5 position, as he's starting to release the club, this red line looks to be more supinated. It's rotated more clockwise relative to the blue line, and at impact, it's still supinated to a similar degree as it was at P6 here. So during his entire downswing, Matthew Fitzpatrick is supinating his trail forearm. Now, in terms of closing the club face relative to the club head path, Matthew Fitzpatrick adopts a very strong lead hand grip at address, where the club face is rotated approximately 60 degrees relative to the back of his lead hand. And when he's at the P6 position, and you can see the back of his lead hand is facing the ball target line, and it's parallel to his functional swing plane. And between P6 and P7, as he swings his lead arm and lead hand, you can see that the back of his lead hand remains parallel to the ball target line and parallel to his functional swing plane. There's very little counterclockwise rotation of his lead hand in his downswing between P6 and P7. And the reason why he doesn't need to is because he already has a closed club face, as you can see here. If you look at his club face in image 2 relative to the back of his lead hand, it's closed by about 60 degrees. So in the late downswing, he doesn't have to rotate his lead forearm counterclockwise very much to square the face. It's probably less than 30 degrees. So you can see he's releasing the club so that the club head catches up to the ball at impact and the club face is square. Now look at his trail palm. Notice that his trail wrist is very extended at P6 and it becomes progressively more straight in his late downswing. But because as he releases the club is not rotating counterclockwise about its longitudinal axis. And therefore when he straightens his trail palm and keeps his trail hand in the same position on the club handle, you can see that as the trail wrist straightens, the trail palm can simply go from being extended to become less extended at impact without any roll motion of the trail palm. Now let's look at another golfer who uses a weak lead hand grip and a weak trail hand grip. So here we have Scottie Scheffler. Scottie Scheffler adopts a weak lead hand grip and a weak trail hand grip. So again, here is Scottie Scheffler at the P6 position. He has P6.5 position, and here he is at impact. I've drawn those same lines over his trail forearm, and you can see he's supinated at his P6 position, and that causes his trail palm to be partially under the club handle and partially behind the club handle at P6. You'll notice that during his entire late downswing between P6 and P7, his trail forearm remains supinated. He never pronates it. Now, what is interesting is that if you look at Scottie Scheffler at P6.5, the back of his lead hand is still facing the ball target line, and it's still parallel to his functional swing plane. There's very little counterclockwise rotation of his lead hand happening between P6 here and P6.5, and you can see that his club face is still open. And if you use a weak lead hand grip, the club face is often straight lined aligned with the back of your lead hand and the watch face area of the lower forearm. Now between P6.5 and impact, Scottie Scheffler has to close the club face relative to his club head arc, and you can see how it happens biomechanically. If you just look at these images, he's rotating his lead, the back of his lead hand, counterclockwise between P6.5 and P7. And I'll go into more detail by showing you another image here. So this is a close-up image to explain what Scottie Scheffler is doing during his late downswing between P6.5 here in image 1 and impact, which is P7 position in image 2. You'll notice I drew a yellow line over his lead lower forearm's radial bone, and you can see it's rotating counterclockwise between P6.5 and P7. You can also look at the back of his lead hand as a reference point, and you can see that the logo on his glove here is also rotating counterclockwise as much as the lead lower forearm's radial bone is rotating. Or you could look at the watch face area of his lead lower forearm, and you can see it's rotating counterclockwise. And that's necessary for him to square the club face in his late downswing. Now, if you look at these lines that I drew over his trail forearm, you can see there's virtually no change in his degree of trail forearm supination. So he's not pronating his trail forearm to square the face. So if you look at his trail hand here, you can see that his trail palm is behind the club handle and partially under the club handle. And as he straightens in his wrist in the late downswing, you can see it's straighter at P7 than it was here, the trail palm must be rotating counterclockwise. And the reason why I say this is that the club is releasing just like it was in Matthew Fitzpatrick's golf swing. But because Scotty Scheffler uses a weak lead hand grip and he needs to rotate his lead hand counterclockwise to square the club face, and because the two palms are facing each other across the club handle, the trail palm has to rotate exactly as much as the lead palm, so it's rotating counterclockwise. But how's that happening? Because can the trail palm rotate counterclockwise, in other words, perform a roll motion at wrist level? Because the only thing that's happening here is he's straightening his wrist. He's not rotating his trail forearm counterclockwise. Now I'm going to explain how this is possible. I'm going to explain why Scotty Scheffler has a supinated trail forearm in his late downswing, and then I'm going to provide an explanation to explain how it is possible for him to roll his trail palm counterclockwise in perfect synchrony with his lead palm between P6.5 and P7. So what I'm going to do is, before I do that, I'm going to introduce another concept. This is the concept of swinging on plane during the late downswing, where you keep your club shaft moving parallel to the functional swing plane between P6 and P7. So this image that I'm showing you here is a strobe image that was made in the 1930s of a golfer, Bobby Jones, who was a very famous PGA Tour golfer who won many competitions. And what you can see in the first image, he's using an iron, and in this image he's using, second image, with the downline view, he's using a wood, could be a driver or a fairway wood. The first point I want to make is that if you look at him at the end backswing position, he probably has a roughly 90-degree angle between the club shaft and his lead arm. And he retains that angle in the early mid-downswing to about this position between P5.3 and P5.5, and then he starts to release the club so that it catches up to his lead arm by impact. The other thing you can notice, if you look at this view, and you look at his club head arc, you'll notice how perfectly symmetrical his club head arc is relative to his ball target line. And that allows him to produce a club head arc where the club head will move in the late downswing towards the ball from inside and then becomes square at impact if he perfects his timing of the release of the club. And you can see here the club is releasing the club so that by impact the club head will be square. So he's generating an in to square club head arc. Notice how the club head goes in post impact. And he's perfecting the release of the club so that the club head at the moment of impact is in the perfect position on his in to square club head path so that it's facing the target. The other thing he needs to do to hit the ball straight is he's got to square his club face relative to his club head path. So if you look here in the early downswing, you'll notice that his club face is very open. And so here at P5.5, this image here, it's still open. And then after P5.5, it becomes progressively more closed so that at impact, his club face is square to his club head path. And if you can square your club face relative to the club head path and make sure that your club head path is zeroed out at impact, then you very likely can hit the ball straight if you hit the ball on the sweet spot of the club face. Now, the most important point I want to mention is look at this zone here. This is P5.5. If you watch the club head path here, you can see that between this zone for P5.5 and impact, his club shaft is traveling parallel to his functional swing plane. So in the early downswing, you can see it was steeper, and he shallows the club shaft in his early mid downswing to about this zone here, P5.5, and after P5.5, he's on his functional swing plane, which is a critical phenomenon that professional golfers need to execute if they want to hit the ball straight. Now, I'm going to the next image, and this image here is an image of Morgan Pressel when she was a teenager, and she is being taught by Martin Hall, the golf instructor here. And this device represents a plane board, this one's made of plastic, but many of them are made out of wood. And this board and its tilt angle represents the functional swing plane. So what a professional golfer has to learn is during the late downswing between P6 and P7, he needs to keep his club shaft on that functional swing plane during that time period. And this is the major discovery I've made, is why professional golfers supinate their trail forearm. And the answer is they need to do that to keep their club face on the functional swing plane. Now I'm going to stop sharing this image and I'm going to go to my video cam image. And I'm going to turn on my camera. So here I am, and what I've basically said, I made this really surprising discovery that professional golfers supinate their trail forearm in the late downswing, and that surprised me. And I had to think for many years, why do they do this? And I now have an explanation which I'm going to now provide. I also realized that if they supinate in their trail forearm, if they adopt a weak or neutral lead hand grip in the late downswing between P6.5 and P7, they have to supinate the lead forearm to square the face. And I thought to myself, well, if the two palms are facing each other across the club handle, then the trail palm has to rotate counterclockwise in perfect synchrony with the lead palm. And then I thought, well, how's this possible if they supinate in the trail forearm? How does the trail palm roll counterclockwise? And I thought about this for a long time, and I have an explanation which I'm now going to demonstrate. So I'm going to move my chair out of the way. And I'm going to take a golf club here just for demonstration purposes. Now I'm doing this video in one of my spare bedrooms, and you can see there's a wall here and there's the edge of my bed here, and there's only 6 feet of space here for me to demonstrate with a golf swing, and I don't have, so I therefore took a small golf club which is designed for a 5-year-old child just for demonstration purposes. So let's consider the concept of swinging on the functional swing plane. So if you look at a golfer, let's say I'm going to just adopt a neutral, weak grip. So I put my thumb on 12 o'clock position, and this represents a weak lead hand grip. And when you have a weak lead hand grip and you hold it straight like this, you'll notice the club face is more or less in line with the back of the hand and also the watch face area of the lead lower forearm. Now, in the downswing, as I said, if you look at Scotty Scheffler, he is shallow in the club shaft to his functional swing plane between his end backswing position and the P5 position here. And when he does that, he has to supinate his trail forearm as the club shaft shallows out, like this. And when he gets to the P6 position, here I am at the P6 position, you'll notice that his trail palm is partially under the club handle in this position. Now, watch what happens in the late downswing. So you've come down the plane to P6, and then you have to stay on the functional swing plane in the late downswing. So like this. You don't need the trail forearm to do it. If you're a skilled golfer who only has a lead arm and you don't have a trail arm, you still can perform the golf swing perfectly if you can master an ability to keep the club shaft on the functional swing plane between P6 and P7. Now, having a trail arm is useful because it can work in perfect synchrony with the lead hand. So here I am at P6, and I'm swinging on the functional swing plane. Now watch what my hand's doing. Notice, to keep it on the functional swing plane, I start off in this position. Now I'll step back a bit and go to the end backswing position. If you look at a professional golfer like Scotty Scheffler, the end backswing position, the trail upper arms abducted away from the body. The trail arm is bent roughly 60 to 90 degrees, and the trail wrist is extended like that. And during the early mid downswing, professional golfers do a motion like this, where they adduct the arm towards the trail side of the body like that. And the elbow at P6 ends up very close to the trail shirt seam area. In some professional golfers, it might be just in front of the trail shirt seam, like Dustin Johnson. If you look at Rory McIlroy's swing at P6, he's actually like this. There's a little bit of an air gap here, but this is more or less how they look. So as I said, the trail forearm is supinating as they shallow the club shaft and they get to this position. Now, from here, let's consider what the trail forearm has to do in the late downswing to keep the club shaft on the functional swing plane. So I'm going to try to step away so that you can see more of my body. So you come to the P6. Now the club is starting to release. And as the club releases like that, the trail hand, which is on the club handle, has to maintain its same position. So it's there to here, from P6 to P6.5. Notice that if you, in this position, they try this out. Try to keep your trail palm on the club handle in this clamp. And when you get to P6.5, where it's angled at 45 degrees, notice as you do this, you actually have to supinate slightly more to keep it on that position. Then between P6.5, where it's angled at 45, to impact as it squares, it will become less supinated. So the reason why professional golfers supinating. This is the motion, what it looks like. If you study any professional golfer, they're supinating their trail form. They are not pronating it like many golf instructors teach their student golfers. They say you need to pronate to square the face. Okay, so that's the function of why the trail forearm supinates. Now we have to solve the second problem. I mentioned to you that Scotty Scheffler gets to P6.5, say at this position here, and then from here he has to square that face because the club face is still open relative to the club head path. And the way he does that is this motion. You see, the club is releasing, so he's going from radial deviation towards ulnar deviation so that the club can catch up to the lead arm by impact. But at the same time, he has to supinate his lead lower forearm to square the face, like that. Now, if you are in this position at P6.5 and you supinate and your trail palms behind the club handle, notice what happens between P6.5 and P7. Your trail palm has to roll in perfect synchrony with the lead palm. So if the lead hand's rotating counterclockwise, this hand has to rotate counterclockwise in perfect synchrony with the lead hand. But how's that possible that it's rolling in that direction without any trail forearm pronation? In other words, as I've demonstrated in a professional golfer, during the entire late downswing all the way to impact, the trail forearm is supinated. So there must be another biomechanical mechanism that allows the trail palm in the late downswing to rotate counterclockwise in the subset of golfers who use a weak or neutral lead hand grip. So how's that possible? So I'm going to explain how that is possible. So if you look at in terms of wrist motions, you can move your wrist like that. This is what's called a hinging motion of the reed wrist. Say if that's the neutral position, now your wrist is extended, and then you straighten your wrist and you move to what's a condition of flexion, palmar flexion. So that's one wrist motion that the wrist can perform. Another wrist motion you can see is you can go from radial deviation to ulnar deviation. And then that's called cocking up and down cocking or uncocking your wrist. So those are the two motions that the wrist can perform. But can the wrist actually roll? Now, many people believe that if you see a golfer and you see the trail palm rolling counterclockwise, they always presume it requires a forearm motion. But as I said, professional golfers are not rolling their forearm counterclockwise. They keep supinating. They're doing this motion. So if there is any counterclockwise roll motion, it's happening at wrist level. So how is that possible? So watch this. I'm going to use my left hand to hold my trail forearm so that it can't pronate and supinate. And then I'm going to show you how it's possible for the trail palm to roll. Watch this. See, I'm rolling it in that direction, or I can roll it in the opposite direction. So that it's possible for a roll motion to happen at wrist level. Then you might ask, how's that possible? What is this phenomenon that I'm demonstrating? This phenomenon is called wrist circumduction. It's the biomechanical mechanism which allows the wrist to roll. Now, how's that possible? So I'll demonstrate. So let's say you extend it and you're going to now straighten your wrist towards palmar flexion. If you at the same time go, I'm going to start in radial deviation, and as I straighten I move to ulnar deviation, you see how it's rolling? If I start the opposite, I start in ulnar deviation, and now I go from extension to flexion, notice it's rolling in the opposite direction, you see? So it's the combination of the two wrist motions that are possible. Your wrist can move in a hinging motion, and it can also move in this up-cocking, down-cocking motion. And when you combine the two, it is possible for your wrist to roll. And that's what happens in professional golfers who use a weak or a neutral lead hand grip. And during the late downswing, I'm going to put the two palms together so that you come to P6.5 and you supinate it. Now, to square the face, Scotty Scheffler does a motion like this. And because he also has a weak grip where the two palms are parallel to each other across the club handle, notice how I can roll my trail palm in perfect synchrony with the lead palm whilst still keeping the forearm supinated. So I believe my explanation makes rational sense and explains two things. Why professional golfers supinate the trail forearm, which is to keep the club shaft on the functional swing plane. And then it explains in how the ability to circumduct your wrist allows you to square the face if you need to, because you use a weak lead hand grip. Finally, I'm just going to talk about the concept, is this motion that happens in the subset of golfers who need the trail palm to roll in the late downswing, is it passive or active? Now, there are certain golf instructors who teach the idea that it's the trail arm that is used to square the face. And they say it provides the power to so when you see Scotty Scheffler supinating his trail forearm and the club shaft is rotating counterclockwise about its longitudinal axis, they say it's due to the pressure of forces produced by the trail palm, like this. But obviously that's not true, because they're not pronating the forearm. Then your question is, if a professional golfer is supinating his trail forearm, and then in the late downswing there's just a bit of wrist circumductory motion, do you really believe that it has the power to twist the club handle about its longitudinal axis, and also has the power to rotate the lead lower forearm counterclockwise? I don't believe it. I believe that in a professional golfer, the swing, you pull in with your lead hand down towards impact and pull in on the club handle. Then you release the club in the late downswing, and if you use a weak or neutral lead hand grip, you're going to supinate as I'm demonstrating here. I believe that this wrist motion, circumductory wrist motion, is passive. There's another reason why I believe that it's passive. There are two famous biomechanists who have studied the golf swing, and they used the computer modeling process of inverse dynamics to study the forces being applied to the club handle in a professional golfer. And they just claim, and I tend to believe them, that in the late downswing in pro golfers, the trail palm is not applying a push pressure against the aft side of the club handle. So as you're releasing the club, and then it's rotating, and then you have your palm against it, they say that when the club handles, you're swinging really fast with the driver, they say that there's no push pressure being applied by the trail hand. The trail palm can barely keep up with the club handle. So what I'm basically saying is it's passive. So when you look at what's happening, this is active. So they actively supinate their 12 form to keep the club shaft on the plane. And then if there's any wrist circumductory motion, it happens passively in that subset of golfers who need to supinate their lead forearm in order to square the club face. So that ends my explanation, and I'm now going to stop the recording.